How's it going, everybody? Today we're going to be looking at the end of World War II in the Pacific. So we'll specifically be looking at how the Allies defeat the Japanese in the Pacific, as well as the decisions to use the atomic bombs in Japan, as well as the cost and aftermath of those bombs. So let's go ahead and get going here. Now, you may remember that we already kind of talked about the beginnings of the Pacific theater of World War II. In the beginning, the Japanese were winning. They were pushing the British back towards India. They were threatening to conquer or to land in Australia. And the early goings of the war in the Pacific were definitely not very good for the Americans, right? The Americans had some pretty bad losses to start. But then the tide turned with the battles of Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, as well as smaller events like the Doolittle Raid. And so by 1943, the Allies had begun to move towards Japan. And by October of 44, the Allies had essentially destroyed the entire Japanese Navy, which was, along with their air force, most of which was launched from its carriers, was kind of the main portion of their army. And so the Japanese grew increasingly desperate, and they also grew increasingly scarce of experienced soldiers, especially fighter pilots. And so they turned towards the use of kamikaze pilots, which were essentially Japanese pilots whose primary purpose it was to basically fly their planes into American ships. They would have bombs filled in their planes. They would be committing suicide by doing so. And most of these kamikaze pilots were very young men, ages 16, 17, 18, in some cases even younger. Because at this point, Japan had run out of older, more experienced pilots, as so many of them had been killed in fighting. The reasoning here for the Japanese, the idea was, if we show the Americans how fiercely we're going to fight, they will eventually give up. There was, if you guys think back to our look at kind of preconceived notions of both the Japanese and the Americans, there was this idea that Americans were weak and didn't have the stomach for a long, drawn-out war. By March of 45, the U.S. had captured Iwo Jima, which was one of the most fierce battles of the Pacific Theater. We already talked about this a couple weeks ago, but just to reiterate, of the 20 or 21,000 soldiers, Japanese soldiers defending Iwo Jima, about 19,000 were killed before they surrendered, which was a huge, huge amount. The Japanese were literally fighting to the death. And so this kind of played a role in the decision making later on to use the bombs, and I'll get to that in a minute here. Then in April of 45, Roosevelt passed away. His health had been declining for a while, but he was able to hide that generally well from the public, but he eventually lost his life, and Vice President Harry S. Truman took over. Now, in fact, Truman had no idea that we had even been developing the atomic bombs, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second here. By June of 45, the Allies had captured Okinawa, which is only 350 miles from Japan. So at this point, we were knocking on the door of mainland Japan. And also keep in mind, Okinawa was another battle which was almost as fierce as that of Iwo Jima. So at this point, we had to decide what to do. Because of the Japanese use of kamikaze pilots, because of their reluctance to surrender in any of these battles, their tenacity in defending the land they controlled, there's a huge fear that invading mainland Japan, with a D-Day style invasion, and it would be a much, much bigger invasion than D-Day, would cost upwards of 500,000 Allied lives, 500,000 American lives. It's always been U.S. military dogma or military policy to limit the loss of American lives in whichever decisions are made, kind of the opposite of Soviet ideology at this point in time. And so once Truman learned about the bomb, kind of imagine this, right? Truman is vice president, which is kind of you don't really do much as vice president. He's, sitting there doing nothing. And then he hears that the president dies, right? Obviously he's shook, but then he also hears like, hey, by the way, we've developed this new bomb the world has never seen before, and you have to decide how to use it. So it was, no pun intended, really kind of dropped on him. Um, and so eventually, after much debate, Truman decided that the atomic bomb would be used in order to end the war more quickly. They first dropped the bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th, 1949, and then Nagasaki was also bombed about 3 days later on August 9th. The Japanese would eventually uh, indicate that they were going to surrender on August 15th, although that would not be signed until September. Um, the the U.S. had actually planned to potentially drop more bombs had the Japanese not surrendered, and I do think that the fact that these two bombs were dropped and it still took about 6 days after the second bomb being dropped does kind of point to what the U.S. military was saying about the Japanese not giving up easily. That's obviously more complicated than that, but I think that does kind of speak to this ideology. So, next question. What was the impact of the atomic bomb on the survivors? Well, the thing with the atomic bomb was that it wasn't a typical bomb in which once, the blast is over and once you put out the fire, you've controlled it, right? The Obviously there was the initial blast that happened right away. As we see here in Nagasaki, the in Hiroshima, the blast expanded over 2,000 yards, if not more, from the actual ground zero or center point of where the bomb was dropped. And so the cost of this bomb, the damage done by this bomb, was truly massive. Okay, here we see an image of the cities before and after. Okay, and these are scale models, but they show really the destruction that these bombs wrought upon these Japanese cities. Okay, here's some actual pictures. Nagasaki before and after. Okay. Now, people called the Hibakusha were people who were within a few kilometers of the hypocenters, but didn't die right away. They were exposed to radiation from the fallout of the bomb. A nuclear bomb uses up most of the radioactive material, right? Which is why, so if you guys have heard of like Chernobyl, right, where it was that massive disaster with the nuclear plant, that was much worse in terms of radiation because it was slowly and still slowly being essentially leached into the area. Whereas with a bomb, most of it is used right away. However, a lot of it or some of it is still over time dropped down. So people who lived in these cities over time started to show symptoms of radiation poisoning, which were very serious. Now, the U.S. claimed they did not know about the impact of these bombs right away, but there had been quite a lot of research done. So it's unclear how much that holds up in court. People who were exposed to the radiation, many of whom developed cancers and other diseases and died very quickly. Many babies who were actually still in the womb at this point later on also showed symptoms. Some people were essentially vaporized when the bombs hit. Here they were just left as shadows on the ground. Here we see the number of deaths brought by the bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In Hiroshima, it was between 90,000 and 140,000, and Nagasaki was between 60 and 80,000. Now, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were chosen as the targets because they were of slightly higher military importance than many of the other cities in Japan. There were talks of using the bombs on a city like Tokyo or Kyoto, but Truman and other members of the military squashed that for saying it would be unusually cruel and the only purpose would be to cause more civilian deaths. So they landed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. However, they probably still could have, again, if we're talking about alternatives, they probably still could have dropped the bombs elsewhere, maybe in the outskirts of the city or over the water on a bay city, in order to show the magnitude of the weapons, to sort of scare the Japanese into surrendering, instead of dropping it directly over the city. Again, historians kind of debate as to why these two cities were chosen. Some would argue that it was done as a sort of payback for the brutality of the Japanese in Pearl Harbor. Others claim that they wanted to leave no mistakes about how devastating the bombs would be, and also potentially it was done to keep Stalin out of the war. Stalin at this point had agreed to join the war in the Pacific, but it was clear that he would want to split Japan under his control, much like Germany was split after World War II. And so the fear was that we would have a North-South Korea situation in Japan had Stalin got there. Here we see some more images of the radiation burning on people that lived in the area. And here we see the number of cancer deaths that happened after the dropping of the bomb. So we see that the effects of the bomb continued on for much longer than the actual dropping of those bombs. Here we see an article from the Nippon Times in Tokyo on August 10th of 1945, one day after the second bomb was dropped. It reads, "How can a human being with any claim to a sense of moral responsibility deliberately let loose an instrument of destruction, which can at one stroke annihilate an appalling segment of mankind? This is not war, this is not even murder, this is pure nihilism. This is a crime against God and humanity which strikes at the very basis of moral existence. What meaning is there in any international law, in any rule of human conduct, in any concept of right and wrong, if the foundations of morality are to be overthrown as the use of this instrument of total destruction threatens to do?" So obviously the Japanese would be against the use of the bombs, but there was a lot of condemnation of the use of bombs internationally. And as we get into the Cold War, we'll see that this really sets off the second half of the 20th century with discussions of should we use atomic bombs, who should have atomic bombs, nuclear weapons, and what's the danger of these nuclear weapons. So this is a really, really critical event here for 20th century history. All right, so here's what you guys are going to do. On your Google Doc, you're now going to answer this question. The question is, given what you have learned about the use of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was the U.S. justified in using them? Respond in a paragraph. So you have the information from the lecture here. You're also going to be given some documents, some primary sources of various experts from the time talking about the decision to use these bombs, as well as some historians who have done research on the decision-making process here. So using all that information together, you are then going to respond in a paragraph or so and talk about whether or not the use of the bomb was justified. Okay? There is no right or wrong answer. I want to remind you of that. I just want you guys to be thoughtful, to use your analysis skills we've worked on in class, and to support your answer with some reason. All right, guys. Hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll hopefully see you soon.